Before we begin, if you're a leader who wants to protect your decision quality, energy, and long term performance, everything I referenced today is linked in the show notes. You'll find the Executive Capacity Audit, the waitlist for the Strategic Longevity Collective, and my ebook, Longevity Unlocked, The Genesis. Now let's get into the episode. Welcome to Longevity Unlocked. I'm Sherri Austin, registered nurse and executive longevity and performance advisor. And this podcast is for leaders who refuse to trade their health, clarity, or decision quality for success. Because here's the truth most leadership conversations miss. Performance is biological. Your ability to think strategically, regulate stress, and make high stakes decisions is directly shaped by sleep, metabolic health, recovery, and nervous system stability. But in modern leadership culture, capacity erosion often happens quietly. Nothing appears broken, yet decision quality slowly declines. Clarity fades, energy becomes inconsistent. And over time, leaders begin operating far below the level their potential actually allows. This podcast exists to change that. Each episode explores the physiology of leadership performance and how sleep, stress, nutrition, movement, and recovery shape cognitive capacity, emotional regulation, and long-term resilience. Because sustainable leadership isn't about pushing harder, it's about protecting the biological systems that make high performance possible. If you're a leader who knows there's more available, more clarity, more energy, and greater strategic depth, you're in the right place. Each week on Longevity Unlocked, we explore a different dimension of leadership capacity. This week's theme is decision fatigue. Now let's step into today's conversation, because beneath the surface of most leadership challenges, there's usually a deeper physiological or cognitive pattern shaping what's happening. And once you understand that pattern, you can begin changing the system, not just the symptoms. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why burnout often begins long before exhaustion and how to recognize the early signals that most leaders miss. Invisible burnout is rarely dramatic, but when you learn to spot it early, you can change the trajectory before it becomes crisis. There's a version of burnout that almost nobody recognizes while it's happening, and the reason it's dangerous is because it doesn't look like burnout at all. Most people imagine burnout as something dramatic. Someone quits their job. They collapse from exhaustion. They take 6 months off and disappear to recover. But in reality, the most common type of burnout is much quieter. You're still showing up. You're still performing. You're still meeting deadlines and fulfilling responsibilities. From the outside, everything looks completely fine. But internally, something subtle begins to change. Your curiosity fades. Your emotional connection to your work begins to weaken. Tasks that once energized you start to feel mechanical. You continue doing the work well, but you no longer feel deeply connected to it. This is what I call invisible burnout. And what makes invisible burnout so dangerous is that it can last for years without anyone noticing, including the person experiencing it. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. A few years ago, I worked with a senior executive. We'll call him David. David had what most people would consider an extremely successful career. He led a large division inside a major organization. His team respected him. His projects delivered results. And from the outside, everything about his career looked impressive. But during one conversation, he said something that stuck with me. He said, "Nothing feels wrong, but nothing feels right either." He was still doing his job well. He still understood the strategy. He still made good decisions. But emotionally, something had shifted. Wins felt muted. Losses barely registered. And the work that once energized him now felt like maintenance. At one point, he said, "It feels like I'm acting out my job instead of actually caring about it." And that's when we begin talking about invisible burnout. Because burnout doesn't always begin with exhaustion. Sometimes it begins with detachment. Before we go further, it's helpful to understand what the research tells us about this. This idea is actually supported by research in organizational psychology. When psychologists study burnout, they typically measure 3 dimensions. The first is exhaustion. The second is reduced professional effectiveness. But the third dimension And the one that often appears earliest is emotional detachment from work. When people operate under sustained cognitive demand, the brain sometimes creates psychological distance from the work. Not because someone has lost their work ethic, not because they stopped caring, but because emotional distance is one way the nervous system conserves energy. The fascinating part about this is that performance can remain high during this stage. People can continue producing excellent work even while their emotional engagement with that work quietly declines, which is why invisible burnout often hides inside competence. I remember experiencing a version of this earlier in my own career. There was a period where everything in my professional life looked successful. The work mattered, opportunities were growing, but I started noticing something subtle. Tasks that used to energize me no longer felt interesting. They weren't difficult, I just felt flat. I was still doing the work well, but internally, it felt like I was running on autopilot. And I remember thinking, why does this feel so mechanical all of a sudden? That moment forced me to pause, not dramatically, but long enough to ask myself a question that many high performers avoid asking. Was the work still aligned with who I was becoming? Another leader I worked with noticed invisible burnout in a completely different way. For her, the signal wasn't detachment, it was the disappearance of curiosity. Early in her career, she loved solving difficult problems, but over time, she realized something had changed. She was still solving problems, but they were the same problems, just faster. At one point, she told me, I realized I wasn't learning anymore. And that's a powerful insight because when learning slows down, but performance continues, many high performers mistake stability for success. But psychologically, the absence of growth can slowly erode engagement. Psychologists who study motivation often talk about three drivers of sustained engagement: autonomy, competence, and challenge. When challenge disappears, competence alone isn't enough to maintain motivation. People can remain very good at something while simultaneously losing their psychological connection to it. And when that happens, invisible burnout begins forming beneath the surface. So, how do you recognize invisible burnout early? I often suggest asking yourself three questions. First, has my curiosity about my work declined? Second, do my wins still feel meaningful? And third, am I solving new problems or just solving the same problems faster? Because invisible burnout rarely arrives dramatically. It doesn't explode, it leaks. And the earlier you notice the leak, the easier it is to reconnect with the work that once energized you. Or evolve your role so that curiosity returns. Because the goal isn't simply to keep performing, it's to stay engaged with the life you're building. Before we close, here's something worth reflecting on this week. Invisible burnout rarely announces itself loudly. It usually appears through subtle shifts in curiosity, energy, and engagement. So here's the question I'd leave you with. Where in your work has curiosity quietly started to fade? Because that's often the earliest signal that something important is changing. Take a moment to reflect on what stood out most in today's conversation. Leadership performance isn't built in dramatic moments. It's shaped by the small systems you practice every day. If today's episode resonated with you, you'll find several resources in the show notes to help you go deeper. That includes the Executive Capacity Audit, which helps leaders evaluate the biological and cognitive factors influencing their performance. You'll also find the waitlist for the Strategic Longevity Collective, where I work directly with leaders who want to protect their decision quality, resilience, and long-term leadership capacity. And if you'd like to explore the deeper philosophy behind this work, you can download my ebook, Longevity Unlocked: The Genesis. If this episode helped you think differently about leadership and longevity, consider sharing it with another leader who might benefit from the conversation. And if you haven't already, follow the show so you don't miss future episodes. Until next time, protect your energy, protect your clarity, and lead for the long term.